الحمد لله رب العالمين صلى الله وسلم وبارك على نبينا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين. So inshallah ta'ala this evening we will resume and hopefully conclude our discussion regarding kindness between husband and wife. We have been for the last 2 weeks, 3 weeks, we've been discussing this section of the book Muslim Morals and Manners and the subsection of the Islamic guidelines for dealing with others, and we've reached the guidelines as related to husband and wife. And we'll do, as we typically do, we'll do a cursory review, a brief review of what we've covered thus far to bring us up to date. And so we began by asking some questions, kind of discussing and brainstorming. Why do people get married? And we threw out some reasons. Wa alaikum salam wa rahmatullah. And then we asked, are these reasons that were given, are they the right or wrong reasons? And then we talked about how these motives, whether right or wrong, can affect the outcome of a marriage. And then we talked about whether or not we thought it was something proper for us to expect to get something out of marriage. And most of us felt that that was the case, if that was not unanimous. And then finally, we said more important than what we expect to get out of it, or whether we think we should, what does Allah want us to get out of marriage? What does Allah want marriage to produce? Because at the end of the day, marriage is the type of ibadah. And what should that ibadah produce? How should it be performed in the manner which pleases Allah? And so we mentioned 3 matters that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala points to in the Quran, indicating what He expects marriage to produce and how He expects it to play out. And we mentioned first and foremost that husbands and wives should be garments for each other. And we talked about what that meant. That they should be a covering for each other, they conceal each other's faults. That they should be a bed for each other, a means for each other to be gratified and share intimacy. We talked about how they should be a wrapper for each other, meaning they should be close to each other. They shouldn't be far away from each other or detached or disconnected, but they should be very close. Your wife should be the closest, if not one of the closest persons to you. Wa alaikum salam wa rahmatullah. And finally, a relaxant, that the husband and the wife should mutually relax each other and put each other at ease. Then we said the second matter that Allah refers to is living with each other in a manner which is acceptable and generally regarded as good. That this is something also that marriage should produce. And finally, marriage should foster tranquility, love, and mercy. And then we talked about how this is the ideal, this is how it's supposed to play out. But unfortunately, in many cases, especially nowadays, it doesn't. And marriage between a husband and wife in Islam will look like this instead. And so the question came, we mentioned that we have to get back to what Allah wants. We have to get back to marriage producing what Allah wants it to produce. And that led us to the question of how. How do we do that? How do we have a lot less of this? How do we eradicate this, and replace it with this? And so we talked a little bit about the traditional method and how people typically talk about the topic, and how a more acceptable method or approach is to have an objective-based approach, which means that we basically make the matters that Allah wants marriage to produce, we make them our objective. And then we go to the Quran, we go to the Sunnah, and we employ common sense to determine what we should be doing as couples to bring those things about. For example, how do we foster love, tranquility, and peace according to the Quran? How do we foster these feelings and emotions according to the Sunnah, according to common sense? And we started on this journey, and we started first and foremost with treat your spouse as you would like to be treated. And we mentioned the hadith of Anas, the famous hadith called Bukhari, Muslim, in which the Prophet ﷺ, he said, لا يؤمن أحدكم حتى يحب لأخيه ما يحب لنفسه. None of you truly believes until he loves for his brother what he loves for himself. If this is the case for someone who is not related to you, they're not the closest person to you, they don't share your bed, then how much more is it true for the person who what? Who does share your bed, is the closest person to you, and is related to you through this bond of marriage. That if you're supposed to treat this stranger the way you want to be treated, how much more so your wife? And we mentioned how some of the Salaf, like Ibn Abbas, they said, I beautify myself for my wife just like I want her to beautify herself for me. I do unto her as I would like her to do unto me. So treat her as you would like to be treated. Then by that, we went to don't keep score. And we talked about how this tendency to keep score, this tendency to make a tally of the things you have done, what you've contributed, versus what your spouse has done and what they've contributed, that this tendency indicates a corrupt intention, that a person gives only to what? To receive. And that in Islam, we don't give to receive, we give to please Allah. And it also creates a mentality that, look, if you don't reciprocate, if you don't do unto me as I've done unto you, then I have a right to what? Go on strike. And I have a right to withhold your rights until you give me my rights, and that's wrong. Islamically, when somebody has a right over you, you have to fulfill that right, even if they don't fulfill your right. The fulfillment of their right is not predicated on them fulfilling your right. But that's what people who keep score, that's what they think. And that mentality is wrong. So we talked about that. And then we talked about lifting your partner up rather than putting them down. And how insults and ridicule, what does that produce? It produces animosity, produces resentment, produces tension, bitterness. And all these things run counter to what Allah wants marriage to produce. So the last thing a couple should do is be in the habit of what? Insulting each other and putting each other down. Rather, they should do what? Lift each other up. We came to you can catch more flies with honey. And that basically means that we should be what? Gentle with each other. Treat each other kindly. As the Prophet ﷺ, he said in the hadith, إِنَّ اللَّهَ رَفِيقٌ يُحِبُّ الرِّفْقِ يُعْطِي عَلَى الرِّفْقِ مَا لَا يُعْطِي الْعُنْفِ. That Allah is gentle and He loves gentleness. And He gives through gentleness what He will not give through harshness. And we talked about how gentleness, it is something which Allah refers to in the Quran as having the ability to what? To change the hearts. To win people over. As He says about the people who respond to cruelty with kindness, فَإِذَا الَّذِي بَيْنَكَ وَبَيْنَهُ عَدَاوَةٌ كَأَنَّهُ وَلِيٌّ حَمِيمٌ. You will find that the one who is your most bitter enemy will become your nearest and dearest friend. If what? If you're gentle. Also, common sense plays into this. That people are more inclined to be nice to you, to love you, if you're what? If you're gentle, if you're nice to them. And if you're not, they're more likely to what? To be repulsed by you. To have an aversion towards you. To hate you, to despise you. And Allah even refers to this or alludes to this in the Quran when He says to the Prophet ﷺ, فَبِمَا رَحْمَةٍ مِّنَ اللَّهِ لَنْتَ لَهُمْ وَلَوْ كُنْتَ فَضًّا غَلِيظَ الْقَلْبِ لَنْفَضُّوا مِنْ حَوْلِكَ. He said it was by the mercy of Allah that you were lenient towards them. Because if you had been harsh and hard of heart, they would have fled from about you. So it's critical for us to realize that we can catch more flies with honey. If we really want to earn our spouse's love, their respect, their honor, then we can do that through what? Gentleness. And we'll be less likely, in fact, unlikely to do that through harshness. We talked about accentuating the positive. And we said that basically what that means is that is that it's impossible to have a happy relationship if you come into it with this cup half empty mentality. If all you can do is focus on the negative, if all you can do is see what your spouse doesn't have, what they won't give, what they'll never be. But rather what we have to do is we have to look at the things that they do have, that they do give, and which they what? They are capable of. And focus on that. As the Prophet ﷺ said in the hadith, he said, لا يفرق مؤمن مؤمنة إن كره منها خلقا رضي منها آخر. He said, let not any believing man despise a believing woman. If he dislikes some quality that she has, he is undoubtedly pleased with another. So maybe she's not the best cook, but she's really good at taking care of the house, taking care of the children. She's always dependable and reliable. If you need something done, she takes care of it. Let him focus on those things rather than the opposite. Maybe the husband isn't the richest, he's not the wealthiest, he's not the most generous, but what? He's kind, he's a good father, he helps around the house, he always makes sure that things are taken care of, etc. So let's focus on the positive, accentuate the positive, instead of focusing on the negative. By that, we talked about spending quality time. And basically the message here was that when you have a couple that they have no time for each other, they can't find time to spend together, they ultimately drift apart. If they can't find time to spend together, they don't spend time together, ultimately they're going to drift apart. So it's critical for the couple to make time for each other. And the Messenger of Allah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, he's our example in this, like he's our example in other things. That he used to make it a point every day, although the Prophet ﷺ was not like ordinary men. Ordinary men have one job. They have one responsibility. But the Prophet ﷺ, he was the Prophet of Allah, the Messenger of Allah. He was the primary teacher of the Muslims. He was the head of state. He was the chief of staff. Or, chief of staff, that's right. Chief of staff means what? He's the head of the Muslim army and their chief strategist. He's also the diplomat, the representative of Islam. He has all these hats to wear, plus he's a husband and a father. But he would do what? He would make time. He would make time to visit all of his wives every day after Salat al-Asr. In addition to this, he would make it a point to have dinner with all of them. As often as he could, they would collectively have dinner. And then he would go to the house of the wife with whom he would spend the night, and he would make it a point to chat with her after Salat al-Isha, to amuse her and to see how she was doing and what her needs were, etc. In addition to this, he would be creative in finding ways to spend time with his wife. So for example, if he was at home and they were doing chores, he would do the chores with them. So this is a way that he would be creative. We're doing something together, we're spending time together, even if it means I have to what? Pick up a broom and sweep. So the couple should be likewise. That basically, if there are things that they even normally would do separately, they do them together. If they're having a hard time finding time to spend together, they become creative, or they exert themselves to be creative in making time for each other. Think about that. Do I need to move, Sheikh? Is that me doing that? Maybe. You want me to shift this way? All right. What's happening here? Why is it not responding? Let's see. All right. We talked about being affectionate. And how expressions of affection, they don't cost you anything. They are free. But in spite of this fact, couples, sometimes, Islamic couples have a tendency to be very stingy when it comes to what? Expressing affection. Or they come under the belief that affection is only to be expressed at what? A specific time, in a specific place, when the lights are off, etc. And so we said no, that we should be what? Make it a point to be affectionate. And that we shouldn't just tell our spouse, although you should tell them. You should tell them a lot. But we shouldn't just tell them we love them, we should show them. They shouldn't just hear that we love them, they should feel it. They should feel your love. And so you need to be affectionate. The Prophet ﷺ was a very affectionate man. And a very romantic man, we gave the example of how he would sit with Aisha and eat with her. And they would share, they would eat from the same pot, the same bone, whatever. And whenever she ate from the bone of a piece of, from the meat of a piece of bone, he would make it a point to what? Turn that piece of meat so that his lips would be where her lips had been. If she drank from a vessel, he would make it a point to take the vessel and do what? Turn it so his lips would be where her lips had been. So he's a very affectionate and romantic man, and so it's incumbent upon us to be likewise, because he is our example in everything. ثم بعد ذلك, we talked about living according to your means, and how one of the leading causes of divorce is money issues and financial problems. That people have a tendency, especially in this capitalist society and the times in which we live, they have a tendency to associate money with security and stability. So if we don't have money, it's as if what? The world is about to end. And so what happens from that is when couples are not careful and they live above their means and they get into debt, they start fighting about money. And when they fight about money, that creates animosity, bitterness, it creates tension, and all of that runs counter to the love, mercy, tranquility, etc. that Allah wants marriage to produce. We talked about giving thanks, appreciating your spouse, and never taking them for granted. And we mentioned the hadith in which the Prophet ﷺ, he said, "Man lam yashkur Allah." "Man lam yashkur al-nas, lam yashkur Allah." That whoever does not thank the people, has not properly thanked Allah. So we have to realize that it's incumbent upon us, wajib, it's wajib, required of us to what? Thank people. When they do us a favor, when they do something nice for us, we're supposed to thank them. And so we're supposed to make them feel appreciated. Nobody likes to be taken for granted. At the same time, when you appreciate people, they're more likely to what? Continue doing the things that they're doing for you. Doing these little nice things, these little favors, these little acts of kindness. They're going to continue to do that. But when you show no gratitude, when you are indifferent, when you are, even worse, when you are ungrateful, they're more likely to say what? Why bother? Why go to all the trouble when the person does not what? Doesn't appreciate me or appreciate the things that I do. And we have some of these nice statements. Look at the one at the bottom. Appreciate me while I'm here. Or watch me as I leave. Nothing hurts more than being taken for granted. Look at the one in yellow. Don't take your relationship for granted. For someone somewhere out there will be glad to take your place. You guys ever heard that statement? One man's trash is another man's treasure. That plays out a lot. Yeah. People get tired of being taken for granted, and they move on. And when they move on, there's what? There's a line of people waiting to what? To lay claim. Because they realize the good thing that you had that you what? Took for granted. Don't be that person. Don't be that person. Get your priorities straight. And we talked about this extensively. And we mentioned the commentary of Sheikh on the hadith in which the Prophet said, he said, أكمل المؤمنين إيمانا أحسنهم خلقا وخيركم خيركم لأهلي وأنا خيركم لأهلي. He said, the believer who has the most complete or perfect faith is the one who has the best character, the finest character. And the best of you are those who are best to their wives, and I'm the best of you to my wives. And we mentioned how Sheikh talked about, or he commented on this hadith and talked about how people have a tendency to save all of their good character for what? Their friends and comrades. For total strangers. But when they come home, they intimidate. When they come home, they don't know what generosity is. They don't know how to be generous. They're cruel, they're intimidating, they are coarse, they are harsh, etc. But when it comes to what? People outside of the home, then what? They're kind and generous and lenient, etc. And he says it should be what? Should be the opposite, as indicated by the hadith of the Prophet ﷺ. And we gave some examples extensively. We gave many examples, some practical examples. We go on and give lots of examples. But at the end of the day, what we need to realize is that your spouse deserves your best. Not whatever is what? Left after you've smiled in the face of total strangers. And that happens. You go out with family and they meet the cashier in Walmart, right? They meet the person at the tire shop. And they're just smiling. They get in the car with you. It shouldn't be like that. Don't smile in the face of strangers and then give the mad dog face to your husband or wife. Don't be the one who you speak kindly to others, but you save all of what? The negative, the harshness, the abrasive speech, the belligerent speech for what? For your spouse. Don't be the one who the neighbors, I have to what? I have to feed them. I have to give them food. And the husband comes home hungry and there's nothing to eat. Oh, I gave the last to the neighbors. Why don't you go out and fetch something? Shouldn't be like that. Should be what? The opposite. So this is what we talked about. Get your priorities straight. Make your man your number one priority. Make your woman your number one priority. After what? After mom, dad, and your closest relatives comes what? Your spouse. They shouldn't be last on your list. Last in terms of what? The list of priorities. From about that, we talked about consider and respect your spouse's sensibilities. And now everybody has something that what? Annoys them. Gets under their skin. They can't really tolerate it. They can't put up with it. And so what we do as spouses is we try to respect those sensibilities, those things that annoy and vex our spouse. And if it's not something that we have to do, then if it's not haram for us to give it up, then we what? We'll give it up. We'll sacrifice that thing. Even though it's something that we might like to do or might want to do, we'll give it up because what? It really bothers them. It really annoys them. And we mentioned how some people will say immediately, well, it's not haram. Why should I have to give it up? They shouldn't think about whether or not it's haram or halal, whether they can do it or not. They should think about what? Allah's pleasure. Allah will be pleased if you sacrifice this for the sake of what? Your spouse's pleasure. And they should also think about what? The goal of marriage, which is to achieve what? Peace and happiness. And that you certainly will create that in the home if you give up something that annoys your spouse. And we gave the example of Asma bint Abi Bakr, who was offered a ride by the Prophet ﷺ while she was walking from the land which the Prophet had given to Zubair to cultivate, which was about 1.25 miles from Al-Madinah. And we're talking about rough terrain, sometimes barefoot walking. And she's carrying this big thing of grain on her head. It's probably hot, beating down, scorching heat. And the Prophet offered her a ride. Ride on his camel to what? To the city center. But she said no, she refused. Why? She said, I remembered Zubair's jealousy. That was one of his what? Sensibilities. He wouldn't like that. So she gave up what would make her happy to make him happy. So these type of sacrifices we make, considering our spouse's sensibilities. ثم بعد ذلك, there's one before this. Where is? Okay. So we talked about the concept of compromise. And how the Prophet ﷺ, when it came to his wives, that if they wanted to do something, and that wasn't particularly what he wanted to do, but it wasn't haram, he would acquiesce. He would give in to them and do it their way. Okay? I want to go to the gym. I want to pump some iron. But my wife wants to go for a walk. A walk is not going to do anything for me. So it's not going to do it, but she wants to go for a walk. Okay, let's skip the gym and go for what? Go for a walk. It's not haram. It's not going to hurt me, and it'll make her what? Happy. Let's compromise. Okay? Alright? Another thing he was often what? He would be content. And we gave the example that Ibn al-Qayyim gave of how the Prophet ﷺ would never ask for something which was not present in the home. And whatever was given to him to eat, he would eat it. He would be content with it. And he wouldn't ask for something that wasn't present and available. Whatever they had, he ate. If he wanted it, he ate it. If he didn't want it, he didn't eat it. But he never would complain. He was always content. So we need to practice that. Practice this compromise and contentment. We talked about advising and being advisable. And we talked about how you can't have a marriage, a successful marriage, if the lines of communication are closed. If there's no way that your husband can say, this is bothering me. I need to get this off my chest. And vice versa. If those lines of communication are closed, and the two spouses can't communicate with each other that which is bothering them, that which annoys them, that which is they're uncomfortable about, then that's going to bring about problems, bring about difficulties. If one of them refuses to talk, if they bottle things up and refuse to talk, again, that's going to be destructive. That's a destructive quality or character. So the couple has to what? They have to open those channels of communication. They have to what? Advise and be advisable. Advise, what does that mean? It means that if something is wrong, if the spouse, the wife, the husband is doing something wrong, doing something harmful, doing something which runs counter to what marriage is supposed to produce, then you need to what? You need to say it. As the Prophet ﷺ said in the hadith, he said in the hadith of Abi Sa'id al-Khudri, collected by Muslim, مَنْ رَأَى مِنْكُمْ مُنْكَرًا فَلْيُغَيِّرْهُ بِيَدِهِ فَلَمْ يَسْتَطِعْ فَبِلِسَانِهِ. He said, whoever amongst you sees something wrong, then let him what? Change it with his hands. And if he can't do that, then let him change it with his tongue. Let him say, hey, this is wrong. This makes me upset. This hurts me, whatever. They need to what? Advise. They need to not be the people who what? They're like a mute devil. They see something wrong and they what? Remain quiet. Why? Because that's only going to last for so long. The person keeps it inside, bottles it up until they ultimately what? Explode. And when they explode, the damage that is done is something that could have been avoided if they what? Spoke about it when it first became an issue. Be advisable means that you have to be someone that your spouse can open up and say what they need to say. Your spouse needs to be able to be candid. You can't be a person who, when your spouse says, hey, you know, you do this thing and it really bothers me. So your response is, oh, you want to point out faults? Oh, well, let me go ahead and enumerate your faults. You just whip out this what? This long list. I've been waiting for this. I've been saving this, man. And you just start going down the list, right? You can't be that spouse. That if I just tell you something that you do that bothers me, then what? Oh, yeah? Well, I got something for that. I got something to say about that. I can start listing your faults. You can't be the spouse who, whenever your spouse says, hey, this bothers me, you're just going to respond by saying, all you do is what? Complain. All you do is complain. All you do is complain. So you make them out to be what? Basically what you're doing is, you make them out to be the bad guy. You put them on the defensive so they never get to what? Voice their grievance. You can't be the spouse who, when somebody tells you, hey, this is bothering me, you do this, we need to work on this, you just what? You shut down. You just shut down. And so there's no point in talking to you because you've what? You've tuned them out. And you can't be the spouse who every time they say something you have this false sense of indignation. I'm being oppressed. I'm being treated unjustly. Or you start to cry and weep and sob, and so they just feel like in order to what? To keep the peace, I just don't say anything. But they're miserable. That's not fair. You have to be advisable. We're all grown-ups, and so we have to act like grown-ups. Which means that sometimes we're wrong, and our spouse has every right to say, hey, you need to correct this, you need to rectify this, and we should act accordingly. And before I move on to the next topic, I want to mention some helpful tips for giving advice. Some things that we need to bear in mind when we're going to give advice. First thing, we need to choose an appropriate time. Choose an appropriate time for giving advice. So there are times when you give advice which are not suitable and they're going to create what? More problems. Husband comes home from work, just got in, beat, tired, stressed out. That's not a good time to advise him, to drop a bomb on him. Right? You don't do that. Another important advice, or another important etiquette of advice, is check your intentions. Why am I advising? Don't advise to humiliate, deride, or belittle. Some people do that. That basically, I'm only advising you to humiliate you, to criticize you, to make you, basically to cut you down a peg. Your chest is puffed up, I feel. ترى نفسك You know, you're full of yourself, and so I need to what? Take you down a peg. That's why I'm advising. Not because there's really an issue. So we avoid that. Another important point about advising is be fair. Be fair when you advise. Never say always or never when you advise. Somebody will say, for example, a wife might say, I always wash the dishes and you never help me. I always do the laundry and you never do anything. Is there a situation, scenario, where the husband in 30 years of marriage, 20 years of marriage, he's never done the laundry? He's never helped with the dishes? That's highly unlikely. But that's what we do. Sometimes when we get to arguing, we forget about what? Justice. Justice goes out the window. Never say always and never say that. Be fair. Be fair when you argue. But another thing we need to remember, another etiquette, is check your emotions at the door. Check your emotions at the door. All this becoming emotional, whether it is the husband becoming overly passionate, angry, or the wife becoming what? Basically an emotional wreck. Check your emotions at the door. This is deen. I'm saying what I have to say to help you be a better Muslim, be a better wife. I'm saying what I have to say to make you a better Muslim, a better husband. So let's try. Check the emotion at the door, say what needs to be said, and what? And move on. Move out on it. Next one, be civil. Advise gently and avoid raising your voice. When you start raising your voice, the person doesn't hear you anymore. They don't hear you anymore. All they hear is what? You're raising your voice. And that's going to put them on defensive. And when they become defensive, it's going to lead to what? It's going to go from a discussion to an argument. It's going to escalate. Don't be judgmental or prosecutorial. The person is not on trial. You're just advising them. You're not putting them on what? Trial. Mr. Muhammad, where were you yesterday? At 8:30. Stop lying, Mr. Muhammad. No, it's not a prosecution. It's just what? It's just advice. Just give the advice and don't prosecute. Don't judge. And finally, don't hold a grudge. Once you have aired your grievance, move on and put it behind you. Let's just move on. I said what I had to say. You understood what I said. We know what we need to do. And now after that, that thing we just fold it up and throw it away. And it doesn't affect our relationship moving forward. And that brings us now to set reasonable expectations. And you can see from the image that there are different places from which people tend to draw their expectations regarding their husband or their wife. So you have those who films, what they see in movies is what they use to determine what should I expect. And that's not a good source. Because the guy in the Muslim is always handsome, right? He always saves the day. He always has money. They're always going someplace. They're always eating out, right? They're always eating out. He drives the best car. And that's just not realistic. That's just not realistic. Or the internet. Same thing. Television. Same thing. Romance novels. Same thing. This is just not the place where we need to be drawing our expectations of what a husband or wife should be. But rather what we need to do is set reasonable expectations. The scholars of Islam, they talk about this concept of how there are certain qualities of Allah which we as humans are supposed to try to what? To emulate, to imitate within our what? Our human context. And those are indicated by what? The text themselves, the Quran and Hadith. So we mentioned earlier the Hadith where the Prophet ﷺ said, "Inna Allah rafiqun yuhibbu ar-rifq." Allah is gentle. And He loves gentleness. He wants you what? To be as gentle as you can within what? Your human capacity. This is a quality of Allah He wants you to emulate, imitate. We also have the hadith of Ibn Mas'ud where the Prophet said, "Inna Allah jamilun yuhibbu al-jamal." Allah is beautiful. And He loves that you what? Beautify yourselves within your human capacity. Similarly, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, لا يكلف الله نفسا إلا وسعها. Allah does not place on a soul a burden greater than it can bear. Okay? Similarly, imitate Allah in that. Try to be like that as humans. Don't put a burden on other humans greater than they can bear. And we have the famous Arab proverb, if you will, that goes, من أراد أن يطاع فليطلب المستطاع. Right? He who wishes to be obeyed should request that which is achievable. If you want to be obeyed, you want somebody to do something you ask them to do, then ask them to do something which is within their capacity. One of the things, brothers and sisters, that destroys marriages is these unreasonable expectations. And the tremendous amount of pressure that these expectations place on both of the spouses. Some wives expect their husbands to buy them everything. But that might not be realistic if he works at a factory earning $10 an hour. That's just not reasonable. That's not a reasonable expectation. Some husbands, they will give their wife a laundry list of tasks. Okay? 10 things, 20 things, 30 things to do in the day. Before he comes home, all these things to be done. Just start going down the list and checking them off. By the time I come home, all these things to be done. Things that 2, 3, 4 people might not be able to do all those things in one day. But he expects to do it all in one day. And if she doesn't do it, and he comes home and finds some of them undone, he doesn't say, well, man, 28 out of 30 is pretty good. No. He says, you're lazy. You're good for nothing. You're shiftless. What were you doing all day? Well, I was doing these 28 things. But they have these ridiculous expectations. Oftentimes they have spouses. They expect their spouse to remember everything. How could you forget? They want them to foresee future events. How could you not see this coming? They want them to know the unseen. Explain to me how our son got pneumonia. The doctor doesn't even know how he got pneumonia. I don't know. I don't know where that virus was. Was it in the bathroom in the McDonald's? Was it in the Walmart? Was it, I don't know. But you're supposed to know. You should know that. They want you to read their mind. If you really love me, you would know that I was craving ice cream without me having to tell you. They want you to read their mind. So all these unreasonable expectations, they do what? They exhaust your spouse. And rather than foster the feelings of love and mercy that we said marriage is supposed to foster in Islam, they cause your partners a tremendous amount of stress and anxiety. And so what you need to do as a spouse is avoid making ridiculous demands and placing a burden on your spouse greater than what they can bear. ثم بعد ذلك, do not invite or permit outside interference. Do not invite or permit outside interference. The Prophet ﷺ, he said in the hadith, من حسن إسلام المرء تركه لما لا يعنيه. He said, from the excellence of a person's Islam is abandoning that which does not concern him. From the excellent qualities, from the excellence of a person's Islam is when he leaves that, when he concerns not himself with that which does not concern him. So according to the Prophet ﷺ, a Muslim is not supposed to stick his nose where it does not belong. Unfortunately, what happens is that most people fail to realize that other people's marriages definitely fall into this category of that which does not concern you. So because of this, because most people don't see marriage as something which doesn't concern them, you'll find them concerning themselves with the private marital affairs of others, which are none of their business. And it is sad that many marriages owe their demise. Many marriages are ruined, destroyed, due to the meddling of outsiders. Whether these outsiders be relatives or close friends. But what is even sadder is that some husbands and wives invite or encourage this meddling and thereby become accomplices in the destruction of their own marriage. I have personally seen individuals who will run to tell a friend or a family member their side of a disagreement with their spouse. This is what happened, this is what he said, this is what he did. And the outsider, what do? They fail to realize that whenever you have these types of disagreements, there are three sides to the story. His side, her side, and the absolute truth. But what that outsider does is they say, hey, what this person is telling me is the absolute, unadulterated truth. It's free of deceit. It's free of deception. It's free of embellishment. It's 100% true. And they develop these feelings as a result because that guy is so bad or that woman is so bad. They develop these feelings of what? Animosity, enmity towards what? That spouse. How could you do my friend like this? That's what they start to think. And then when they think like that, they want to give advice. Bina'an ala dhalik. They want to give advice based upon that. He did what? You should leave him. And this advice is what? Destructive. And is counter to what the Prophet taught. Because he said, in the hadith of Ali, إِذَا تَقَالَ إِلَيْكَ رَجُلَانِ, if two people come to you and they're disputing, فَلَا تَحْكُمْ لِلْأَوَّلِ حَتَّى تَسْمَعْ لِلْآخَرِ فَسَوْفَ تَدْرِي كَيْفَ تَقْضِي. He said, don't judge for the first one until you hear from the second one. That's when you'll know how to what? Judge. But when you just hear the first side and you just assume that that's the truth and you judge incorrectly. Another thing that happens when you deal with outsiders or when you bring them into your marriage is that you'll have, for example, outsiders who they'll see a couple who conduct themselves in a way, they do things or they interact with each other in a way that they don't approve of, that they personally don't do it themselves. And so they expect you to conduct yourself and interact with your spouse the way they do. But this works for you, it may not work for them. But they don't think about it like that. They expect you to be like they are. So for example, you have a wife who, she doesn't necessarily cook for her husband. Doesn't clean up after him. Doesn't iron his clothes. Doesn't make his lunch. And then there's a wife who does all those things. She waits on her husband hand and foot. She spoils him. So you have that wife who sees another wife doing that, and she'll object. What are you doing? You're going to spoil him. Don't do that. Make him something for dinner and tell him take it or leave it. Don't ask him what he wants. Don't take his order. Right? Don't iron his shirt. He can iron himself. Let him learn how to do things on his own, for his own sake. Stuff like you'll have a woman giving another woman this type of advice. Not thinking that if she acted on this advice, it could do what? It could create a lot of what? Tension and unrest in the home where there was none. Another example, you have a man, he's one of those people who's right into his wife. Does a lot of stuff. Gives her a day off every week. Got to take you out for dinner. You're not going to cook tonight. Brothers see him doing, what's wrong with you, man? You weak? You better man up. Don't take her out because you'll spoil her. She'll expect you to do it all the time. You don't want to do that. Never cook, never clean, never lift a finger around the home, man. Because once you do it once, they'll expect you to do it all the time. Give them that bad advice and it creates what? Tension in the home where there was none. This type of meddling of outsiders, we have to what? Avoid it. Because it can what? Undermine and destroy the marriage, as has happened in many cases. Finally, we're going to close with some other considerations, other things to think about. Communicate. You need to talk to each other. Number 2, your spouse is not the enemy, so you shouldn't be fighting. Why are you fighting? Your spouse is not the enemy. Don't fight. Discuss. Advise each other, but don't fight. Accept Islamic gender roles. That one of the problems that happens in Islamic marriages is that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has given the man a role. And has given the woman a role. And when they don't accept that role, when you have a man who's putting his one leg in the pants, in one leg of the pants, and the woman's putting what? Her leg in the other leg. It's going to lead to what? a problem. It's going to lead to conflict and controversy. Let the man be a man, let the woman be a woman. Accept these Islamic gender rules. Next, don't hold grudges, let it go. You argue, dispute, it happens. We're human. But once you argue and you say what you had to say and you get off your chest, don't hold that as a grudge. Don't let that come up next week or next month or a year later. Oh yeah, you said that thing or you did that thing. Okay, but we dealt with that then. And we should have what? Left that in the rear view. Don't bring your baggage from an old relationship into a new one. That's another problem that we have, that people have a relationship, they get out of that, they get into a new one, and then they what? They bring that baggage with them. And they start projecting onto what? The new spouse, that, you know, oh, the old spouse did that, but that's not me. You follow me? So leave that baggage from the old relationship in that old relationship. Have each other's back. Stand up for each other, defend each other, look out for each other, help each other. When one is down, lift that person up. You're like, look at yourselves like one. Your spouse's problems are your problems. Put your pride aside. If you're wrong, admit it and say, I'm sorry. There's no sin. There's no blame in saying, I'm sorry. I'm wrong. I was wrong. And finally, most importantly, last but certainly not least, fear Allah. Fear Allah. Be conscious of Allah and realize that marriage is half of the deen. It's half of the deen. And when you do these things that we talked about, you are worshiping Allah. You are worshiping Allah and you're seeking His pleasure. Fear Allah when you deal with your spouse. I have these words of advice I want to share because they're beautiful. But I don't know if the time will permit. What do you think, Sheikh? It's like one another, I think, a minute or so. Let's run through them quickly because they're beautiful. So these 10 words of advice is very famous 10 words of advice from a pious woman from the early period, which she gave to her daughter on her wedding day. And so I wanted to share those. The first one, she said, treat him like a master, and he will be your slave. 2, accompany him with contentment. Be satisfied with what he gives you, and do not ask him for what he does not have. 3, live with him attentive to his needs, obeying his wishes. 4, be mindful of your appearance. Let not his eyes see anything in you that repulses him, and let not his nose smell any unpleasant scent. 5, be vigilant regarding his meal times, because the heat of hunger burns fiercely. Ladies, a hungry man is an angry man. A hungry man is an angry man. Make sure that when he comes home, there's something to eat. If you're in the process of making this elaborate 7-course meal for him and it's not quite done, have some finger food, something for him to eat. And I know, like, sometimes he comes home and you want to talk. You got a lot of stuff to unload on. The children did this, and somebody called and said that, and my mom called me and made me mad about that. You got a lot of stuff you want to say on your chest. But he can listen and eat at the same time. So don't do the food like this. Well, you're going to listen to me before I give you anything. No, give him something to eat. Because he's not going to hear you if he's hungry. A hungry man is an angry man. And use common sense. Feed your man. You know how they always say the way to a man's heart is through his stomach? There's some truth to that. I think a more truer statement is that the way to a man's heart is through his mother. If you're kind to his mother, you can win the man. But there's some truth to what? The way to a man's heart is through his stomach. Like 6. Be sure that he's not disturbed whilst he is resting. Because sleep when interrupted incites anger. And that's true. He's tired, let him rest. Once he's rested, then what? Then deal with him. But if he's tired, let him rest. 7. Do not gain pleasure from his pain, nor be tickled by his defeat. You have women who, when the husband says, I went for the promotion, I didn't get it, she's happy about that. She's giddish. Good for you. That's what you get. That's what you get. What kind of wife you're supposed to be on my team. What kind of wife says that? But you have women like that. They're happy when the husband suffers a defeat. 8, Likewise, his happiness and success should not cause you to dismay. I went and got the promotion. I went for it and I got it. She's like, dang, shoot. No, she should be happy for him. When he's happy, she should be happy. And when he's sad, she should be sad. Like what? Like they are one. Number 9, reveal not his secrets. If you do, he may reward your treachery with a similar betrayal. Remember that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said that men and women are garments for each other. And part of that is what? That they cover and conceal each other's faults. He doesn't reveal her faults and she doesn't reveal his faults. They keep each other's secrets and cover each other's faults. Number 10, do not disobey his instructions. For if you flout his authority, you will fill him with bitterness and resentment towards you. We talked about the concept of him putting one leg in one leg of the pants and she's putting the other leg and they're fighting over what? Who's going to be the man of the house? Don't do that. Accept the gender role. The man shouldn't be a tyrant, but the woman shouldn't also be what? Fighting with him over authority. So that's the advices I wanted to share. Beautiful advices. And finally, the Prophet ﷺ, he said, the Quran is either approved for you or against you. And that goes for any type of knowledge. We've all heard it. We've all seen it. We know what we need to do. We can't say that we didn't hear, we didn't see, we didn't know. So now it's time to what? To roll up our sleeves and practically apply what we know. And make the necessary changes we need to make. Treat our women like we want to be treated to the end of the discussion. But now that we know what's right, we need to do what's right. هذا وصلى الله وسلم وبارك على نبينا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين.
الله أكبر الله أكبر الله أكبر الله أكبر أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله